Gerald Thompson floated in the darkness of space above Earth, his magnetic boots keeping him attached to the metal surface of the orbital construction platform. The station called Vega 7 stretched out around him like a massive skeleton, with hundreds of workers moving across its framework. This was humanity's first interstellar gateway, a project that would connect Earth to distant star systems. Every piece had to be perfect. Every weld had to be exactly right because mistakes in space killed people. Gerald had been working construction in zero gravity for 15 years. He knew the feel of metal under his gloves, knew how to spot problems that machines might miss. Today he was inspecting a section of the hull when he noticed something wrong. The weld looked slightly off. The color was not quite right, and when he touched it through his thick glove, the temperature felt strange. He frowned inside his helmet and opened his communication channel. He called his supervisor, Luis Martinez, and explained what he saw. Before Luis could answer, another voice cut through the channel. It was Brandon Pierce, the lead structural engineer for the project. Brandon's voice was sharp and mean. He asked who authorized Gerald to do manual inspections. He said that sensors existed for that purpose and that construction workers should just do their jobs without playing engineer. Gerald kept his voice calm and tried to explain what he noticed. He mentioned the visual signs and the thermal readings that seemed wrong. Brandon laughed at him. The engineer said Gerald thought his eyes were better than million-dollar scanning equipment from an alien race called the Zentari. Brandon told Gerald to get back to his assigned work or face punishment. Several other workers had stopped to listen to this conversation over the shared channel. Gerald felt anger rising in his chest but pushed it down. He had dealt with men like Brandon before, on construction sites back on Earth, in the military throughout his career. The uniform changed, but the attitude stayed the same. These were men who thought their education made them better than people who actually did the work with their hands. Gerald tried once more to explain his concerns, mentioning his 15 years of experience. Brandon interrupted him again. The engineer said he did not care about Gerald's experience. He said this was a precision operation, not some simple Earth construction job. Brandon threatened to have security remove Gerald from the platform if he did not return to work immediately. The channel went silent. Gerald could feel dozens of eyes watching him through their helmets, waiting to see what he would do. Gerald said he understood. His voice was quiet, but everyone heard it. Brandon's holographic image disappeared from Gerald's helmet display. Gerald switched to a private channel with Luis and asked him to log the concerns in the official report anyway. Luis agreed and apologized for Brandon's behavior. He explained that the engineer had been treating everyone badly lately, riding them hard about every small thing. Gerald went back to his assigned position, but his mind stayed on that weld. He had not imagined what he saw, the slight discoloration in the metal, the way it looked just a bit warped, the thermal reading that was wrong by only a small amount. These were the tiny details that separated good construction from disaster. In space, disasters did not give second chances. One mistake could kill everyone on the station. As Gerald worked through the rest of his shift, he watched Brandon Pierce moving through the construction site. The engineer inspected various sections but spent only seconds at each spot. He looked at his datapad constantly, trusting the sensor readings completely. Brandon never touched the materials, never looked closely at the actual construction. He believed the machines were always right, and in Gerald's experience, that belief was dangerous. Brandon stopped occasionally to yell at other workers. His tone was always the same, condescending and cruel. He acted like everyone else was stupid, like only he understood how things should be done. Gerald noticed that most workers tried to avoid Brandon when they saw him coming. The engineer created fear instead of respect, and that was another problem. Workers who were afraid made mistakes because they stopped thinking and just followed orders. 3 days passed. Gerald had filed his concerns through the proper channels, but received only a short message from Brandon's office. The message said all systems were within acceptable parameters. The construction continued. Section 12, the area Gerald had worried about, was sealed and integrated into the larger structure. No one listened to his warning. On the morning of the 4th day, an announcement came over all communication channels. Distinguished visitors were arriving at the station. The Galactic Engineering Council was coming to conduct their scheduled inspection. These were representatives from the most advanced civilizations in known space. Their approval was necessary before the gateway could be activated. Without their permission, the entire project would be shut down. Gerald was working on a different section when he saw the visiting ship arrive. It was beautiful and strange, bending light around itself as it moved. Figures emerged from the ship, floating in space without suits or visible propulsion. They just existed in the vacuum as if it were air. The inspection team had 4 members. 2 looked humanoid but with skin that glowed with bioluminescent patterns. 1 was a floating sphere of contained plasma. The 4th was massive, at least 10 feet tall, with 4 arms and skin like polished black stone. Its 3 eyes glowed amber. Someone whispered over a private channel that the tall one was Coordinator Vexthar, a member of the Talrathi species. His people had been building megastructures for 50,000 years. If he found a serious flaw, the project was finished. Gerald watched the inspection team move through the station methodically. They spent almost an hour examining one section, discussing things in musical tones that the automatic translator could not quite turn into English. Brandon Pierce followed them like an anxious puppy, very different from his usual arrogance. He pointed out various features and explained human engineering principles. The inspectors listened politely but said very little. Then they reached Section 12, the section Gerald had warned about. Gerald was 3 sections away, but he could see them clearly. He watched Coordinator Vexthar place one massive hand on the hull plating, fingers spread wide. The amber glow in his eyes intensified. He stood motionless for several long seconds. Then the coordinator turned to his companions and made clicking sounds. The other inspectors immediately moved closer, adding their own examinations, the plasma being pulsed with different intensities of light as it scanned the area. Brandon's face went pale inside his helmet. The silence that followed Helen's question was heavy with meaning. Brandon's face flushed and he looked away. Luis Martinez cleared his throat. He had been quiet until now, but he spoke up. He told Director Morrison that this was not the first time Brandon had dismissed reports from workers without proper review. Luis had documented 15 separate incidents over the past 6 months. He had been preparing a formal complaint when this inspection occurred. Helen closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were hard as diamonds. She asked Luis why he had not filed that complaint sooner. Luis shifted in his seat uncomfortably. He explained that Brandon was the nephew of Congressman Pierce. Luis had been told by his immediate supervisor that making waves could affect his career prospects. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Helen stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. She promoted Luis to acting lead structural engineer effective immediately. She told him to coordinate with the inspection team to identify and repair all defective sections. Then she turned to Brandon. Her voice could have cut through steel. She told Brandon he was terminated. Security would escort him off the station within the hour. She would personally ensure that every engineering firm in the Sol system knew exactly why he was fired. Brandon's face went through several colors before settling on gray. He stammered that his uncle would hear about this. Helen cut him off. She said his uncle could file a complaint with the project board. She would bury him in documentation of Brandon's incompetence and negligence. Every dismissed report, every structural flaw, every life Brandon put at risk because he was too arrogant to listen to people who actually did the work. She told him to get out of her sight. Brandon left the conference room escorted by 2 security personnel. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss. Vexthar's hologram pulsed with what might have been approval. He said it was a wise decision. But this raised larger questions about quality control protocols. The council would need to conduct a complete review of the entire structure before approving the project for activation. Helen agreed. She said whatever the council needed, they would have full cooperation. Then she turned to Gerald. She told him she owed him an apology. He had done his job correctly and the system had failed him. That would change. Gerald nodded slowly. He asked what would happen to the other workers whose reports were dismissed. The ones on the list Vexthar had shown them. Helen said they would all receive formal commendations and back pay for any penalties they incurred. She wanted Gerald to work with Luis and the inspection team. They needed someone with his eye for detail to help identify any other potential problems. Gerald agreed. As the meeting ended, Vexthar's hologram approached Gerald. The massive Talrathi studied him with those glowing amber eyes for a long moment. He said Gerald had saved many lives today. Not through technology or equations, but through experience and the courage to speak. when others would have remained silent. This was the strength of humanity that the galactic community had hoped to see. Gerald said he had just done his job. Vexthar disagreed. He said Gerald had done far more than that. He should remember this moment. Humanity would need more people like him as they reached for the stars. The next 3 weeks were the most intense of Gerald's career. Working directly with the Galactic Engineering Council's inspection team, he helped identify not just the 17 sections Vexthar had initially flagged, but 23 additional areas where the construction failed to meet required standards. The flaws were not immediately dangerous but would have caused significant problems during the gateway's operation. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. Gerald found himself learning from beings whose civilizations had been building orbital structures when humanity was still living in caves. The Talrathi could sense molecular bonds through their skin, a biological ability that made them natural structural engineers. The plasma being named Luminex could see electromagnetic fields within materials, detecting stresses invisible to any scanner. What surprised Gerald most was how much the alien engineers wanted to learn from him. Vexthar asked him one day to explain his thought process. How had he known to look at Section 12 when the sensors showed no anomaly? Gerald considered the question carefully. He explained it was hard to put into words. There had been a discoloration in the metal, just a slight variation in shade. When he touched it, even through his glove, something felt off. The temperature gradient was not quite right. Luminex said that feeling was not in human equipment specifications. Human tactile sense was not rated for such precision. Gerald admitted that might be true on paper. But when someone did this work long enough, their body learned things their brain did not consciously know. People developed instincts, pattern recognition that went beyond what could be measured. Vexthar made a rumbling sound that might have been a laugh. He said the Talrathi called it hand wisdom. Every civilization that built great things eventually learned this truth. Machines could calculate, but experienced beings could perceive. The tragedy was that many forgot this lesson, usually right before something catastrophic happened. As they worked, Gerald began to understand the scope of what had gone wrong under Brandon's supervision. It was not malice exactly. It was a dangerous combination of arrogance and insecurity. Brandon had been promoted rapidly, pushed forward by family connections rather than experience. He had compensated for his lack of practical knowledge by hiding behind technology and dismissing anyone who questioned his decisions. Lewis explained it one evening over a meal in the station's cafeteria. He said Brandon had been afraid that if he admitted he did not know something, people would realize he did not deserve his position. So he doubled down on the only thing he could control, the sensor data. He dismissed anything that challenged that data. Gerald said quietly that many people could have died because of Brandon's fear. Lewis agreed. But they had not died because Gerald spoke up anyway. That took courage. Gerald knew it might cost him his job. Gerald shrugged. He said he had been fired before, but he had never had someone's death on his conscience. He knew which one he would rather live with. The repairs progressed faster than expected. The Galactic Engineering Council did not just fix the flaws. They taught the human construction teams how to identify and prevent similar issues in the future. Sensor arrays were recalibrated. Inspection protocols were revised. Most importantly, a new system was implemented where any worker could flag a concern that had to be investigated, regardless of what automated systems reported. Vexthar explained during a training session that this was how they built. Technology served the builder, not the reverse. Sensors were excellent tools, but they were not infallible. Trust them, yes, but trust yourselves more. Helen Morrison attended that session and took notes. The director had been practically living on the station since Brandon's firing, personally overseeing every aspect of the reconstruction. Gerald was working on final inspections when Helen's assistant contacted him. The director wanted to see him in her office immediately. Gerald made his way through the station wondering what this was about. When he entered the office, he found not just Helen but also Coordinator Vexthar and the 2 humanoid members of the inspection team. Coordinator Vexthar spoke through the translator system, his voice deep and powerful. He said there was a structural instability in Section 12. The molecular bonding of the primary weld had been compromised. The temperature variation during the welding process had exceeded acceptable parameters by a tiny amount, just 0.03%. Brandon said that was impossible. His voice shook slightly as he insisted the sensors would have detected any variance of that size. He claimed he had personally reviewed all the data from this section. Vexthar replied simply that the sensors were inadequate, or the review was insufficient. The flaw existed regardless of what the equipment reported. One of the humanoid inspectors gestured and a holographic display appeared in the air, showing complex mathematical formulas and structural diagrams. The inspector explained that if this section experienced the dimensional stresses of gateway activation, it would fail catastrophically within 30 seconds. The resulting cascade failure would destroy the entire station and likely kill everyone aboard. A cold silence fell over the communication channel. Every worker within range heard those words. Destroy the entire station and kill everyone aboard. Brandon's voice was barely steady when he spoke again. He said he would review the sensor data once more. There had to be an explanation. That was when Gerald spoke up. His voice was quiet but clear. He said there was an explanation. All eyes turned toward Gerald. He pushed off from his workstation and used his suit thrusters to glide toward the inspection team. He stopped at a respectful distance from Coordinator Vexthar and spoke clearly. He explained that he had flagged this section 3 days ago. He had reported visual and thermal irregularities during manual inspection. His concerns had been dismissed. Brandon's face changed from pale to red. He started to say that was not true, that Gerald was just a construction worker who could not possibly have detected anything. Vexthar interrupted him with one raised hand. The coordinator asked to see Gerald's report. Gerald transmitted the file he had submitted through proper channels. Vexthar's eyes pulsed as he reviewed the document. Then he turned those glowing amber orbs toward Brandon. The coordinator said the report was accurate and detailed. It identified the exact location and nature of the defect they had discovered. He asked why it had been dismissed. Brandon opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. He stammered that the sensors showed everything was within parameters. He had made a judgment call based on the data available to him. Vexthar's voice became hard as stone. He said Brandon had made a judgment that nearly killed everyone on the station. Brandon had prioritized equipment over the experienced assessment of a trained worker. This was a fundamental failure of engineering principle. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Brandon looked around desperately as if seeking support, but no one met his eyes. The inspection was suspended immediately. Vexthar ordered all personnel to evacuate Section 12, while his team conducted a comprehensive analysis of the entire structure. Gerald found himself summoned to the station's main conference room along with Brandon, Project Director Helen Morrison, and Senior Construction Supervisor Luis Martinez. The conference room had a stunning view of Earth below, blue and white and beautiful. But Gerald barely noticed. He stood at attention, still in his work suit though he had removed his helmet. The others settled into seats around the central table. Helen Morrison was a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair pulled back tight. She had built her reputation managing impossible projects. This orbital gateway was supposed to be her crowning achievement. Helen told Gerald to sit down. Her voice was tired but not unkind. Gerald sat. Brandon would not look at him, staring instead at his data pad as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Vexthar's holographic presence appeared at the head of the table, his massive form scaled down to fit the human-sized space. The coordinator said they had completed their preliminary analysis. The defect in Section 12 was not isolated. They had found 17 additional sections with similar structural compromises, though less severe. Helen's face went white. She asked if he was serious. Vexthar confirmed. All 17 sections had been welded or assembled during shifts when Brandon was the supervising authority. All had passed sensor inspection. And in 12 cases, they had found logged reports from construction workers expressing concerns that were subsequently dismissed. A holographic display appeared showing Gerald's report along with 11 others. Some were from human workers, others from Zentari workers, one from a Krellin observer who had pointed out a misalignment in a support strut. Every single concern had been valid. Every single one had been ignored by Brandon Pierce. Vexthar continued speaking. He said this was not merely a technical failure. This was a systematic dismissal of ground-level expertise in favor of over-reliance on automated systems. It was one of the most common causes of catastrophic engineering failures across all civilizations. The galaxy had seen this pattern destroy countless projects over millions of years. Species that learned from it survived. species that did not usually kill themselves before reaching the stars. Brandon finally looked up. To Gerald's surprise, the engineer's face showed confusion more than anger. Brandon said he did not understand. The sensors were state-of-the-art technology. The Zentari had designed them specifically for this project. How could they be wrong about so many things? One of the humanoid inspectors spoke. Her voice was soft but carried disappointment. She explained that the sensors were not wrong. They reported exactly what they were programmed to detect. But programming had limits. Equipment had blind spots. No technology, no matter how advanced, could replace the judgment of an experienced being who knew what to look for beyond the parameters of their instruments. Vexithar added that the Tal Rathi had a saying, "Trust your tools, but trust your hands more." Humans were young in the stars, but they should understand this principle. They built their tallest buildings, their longest bridges, their most complex machines through a combination of technology and human experience. Why would they abandon that wisdom here in space? Helen leaned forward, her fingers pressed together in front of her face. She asked Brandon directly why he had dismissed Gerald's report. Brandon's mouth worked for a moment before words came out. He said construction workers were not engineers. They did not have the education, the training, the theoretical understanding. He thought Gerald was being overcautious, seeing problems where none existed because he did not understand the tolerances they were working with. Gerald spoke quietly. He said he had 15 years of experience in zero-gravity construction. He had served in the military's orbital engineering corps. He had certifications in structural welding, materials science, and vacuum fabrication. He might not have a degree in engineering, but he knew when something was wrong. He had learned to trust his eyes and his hands because they had saved lives before. Helen's voice went very cold. She asked Brandon if he had dismissed Gerald because he was a construction worker, or if there was another reason. Helen told Gerald to sit down. Her voice held something different this time. Not just respect, but excitement. Gerald sat feeling suddenly nervous. He asked if something was wrong. Vexthar said that on the contrary, something was very right. The reconstruction was complete and exceeded all galactic standards. The gateway would be approved for activation. Relief flooded through Gerald. He said that was wonderful news. Vexthar agreed. But they had another matter to discuss. The Galactic Engineering Council had reviewed Gerald's work over the past weeks. His eye for detail, his practical knowledge, his ability to perceive what instruments missed. These were valuable skills. Helen leaned forward. She asked Gerald how he would like to be the new lead structural engineer for the Gateway project. Gerald blinked. He was certain he had misheard. He asked her to repeat that. Helen said it again slowly. Lead structural engineer. It came with a substantial pay increase, access to advanced training programs with the Galactic Engineering Council, and direct authority over all construction and maintenance operations for the Gateway. Gerald said he did not have an engineering degree. One of the humanoid inspectors spoke. His voice was melodious and musical. He explained that in galactic standards, a degree was merely evidence of theoretical education. It was one of many paths to expertise. Gerald's 15 years of practical experience, combined with his demonstrable ability to perceive and solve problems, qualified him far better than a fresh university graduate with no field experience. Helen added that Gerald would need to complete some formal certification processes, but those could be done while he worked. The Galactic Engineering Council had agreed to sponsor his training. He would be learning from the best engineers in known space. Gerald sat back, his mind racing. Lead structural engineer. It was a position he had never even dreamed of pursuing. Men like him, men who started with a wrench in their hand rather than a textbook, did not become lead engineers on the most important construction project in human history. He asked why him. There were other qualified people. Luis Martinez had more supervisory experience. Helen said Luis was excellent and would be Gerald's deputy. But Gerald had something special. He saw what others missed. Vexthar's hologram shifted to display footage from the station's security cameras. Gerald watched himself working over the past 3 weeks. Time and again, the footage showed him pausing at some section of the structure, examining it closely, occasionally flagging an issue the sensors had missed. Vexthar explained that in 3 weeks, Gerald had identified 47 potential problems their automated systems failed to detect. Most were minor, But 12 would have caused significant issues within the gateway's first year of operation. His success rate was unprecedented for a being working without enhanced sensory capabilities. The female inspector added that Gerald possessed what they called in their language structural empathy. The ability to understand a construction not as a collection of parts but as a living system. It was rare and precious. Exactly what this project needed. Gerald thought about Brandon Pierce, about the arrogance and fear that had nearly destroyed this station. He thought about all the times he had been dismissed, ignored, treated as if his experience meant nothing compared to someone's degree or connections. He said if he took this position, he wanted to make some changes. Helen smiled. She said she expected nothing less. She asked what he had in mind. Gerald said first, every worker on this station got respect. He did not care if they had been there 3 days or 3 decades. Their concerns would be heard and investigated properly. No more dismissals based on rank or education level. Helen agreed immediately. Gerald continued. Second, they would implement mandatory cross-training. Engineers needed to spend time doing actual construction work. Construction workers needed to learn more about engineering principles. Everyone should understand the full picture. Vexthar made that rumbling sound again. He said this was how the Talrathi trained. Theory and practice must be woven together, not treated as separate domains. Gerald said third, they needed a better reporting system. Workers should be able to flag concerns anonymously if necessary. Every flag would get a response within 24 hours. Not just noted, but actual investigation and explanation. Helen said it was done. She asked if there was anything else. Gerald said yes. They would document everything they learned here. Every mistake, every fix, every lesson, and they would share it freely with anyone building in space, human or alien. This was too important for egos or profit margins. If humanity was really joining the galactic community, they needed to act like it. The room was silent for a moment. Then Vexthar placed one massive hand over his chest in a gesture of deep respect. He said Gerald honored them with this wisdom. This was the thinking of a master builder. If Gerald accepted this position, he would not only oversee this gateway, he would help define how humanity approached orbital construction for generations to come. Gerald looked at each of them in turn. Helen with her iron determination, Vexthar with his ancient patience, the 2 humanoid inspectors with their bioluminescent patterns pulsing gently. He thought about his father who had worked construction his whole life and never rose above crew chief. His father would have told him to take the job, to prove that people like them could do anything if given the chance. Gerald said all right. He would do it. He asked when he started. Helen grinned. She said he already had. She welcomed him aboard as Chief Engineer Thompson. News of Gerald's promotion spread through the station within hours. The reactions were mixed but mostly positive. Most construction workers were thrilled to have one of their own elevated to leadership. Several Zentari workers performed a ritual gesture with their crystalline limbs that meant approval and respect. But not everyone was happy. Gerald's first day as chief engineer started with a confrontation he should have anticipated. He was in the engineering office getting used to his new workspace when the door opened. 3 people entered without knocking. They were all human engineers, mid-level supervisors who had worked under Brandon. The leader was a woman named Patricia Hartley, a structural specialist in her early 40s with short brown hair and a permanent frown. She stopped in front of Gerald's desk and crossed her arms. She said they needed to talk. Gerald set down the data pad he had been reviewing. He said good morning and asked what he could do for her. Patricia said he could explain why he thought he was qualified for this position. The other 2 engineers, men named Kevin and Andrew, nodded in agreement. Gerald studied them before responding. He said he earned this position by doing his job well and speaking up when he saw problems, the same way anyone earned advancement. Patricia said he was a construction worker. He did not have an engineering degree. He had not published papers or conducted research. He just welded things together. Gerald replied calmly that he did a lot more than weld. But she was right that he did not have a traditional educational background. What he did have was 15 years of practical experience and a proven ability to identify problems that sensors missed. The Galactic Engineering Council seemed to think that was valuable. Kevin interjected that the council wanted to make a statement. They were using Gerald as an example of how humans supposedly valued practical knowledge over theory. It was political. Gerald said maybe. Or maybe they genuinely believed he was qualified. Gerald asked Patricia why it bothered her so much. She leaned forward with her hands flat on the desk. She said they had worked for years to get where they were. They studied and learned the principles and earned their credentials. Now Gerald got promoted above them because he noticed some discoloration on a hull plate. Her voice was tight with frustration. Gerald corrected her. He said he noticed a critical flaw that would have killed everyone on this station. He noticed it because he had the experience to know what to look for, which their precious sensors missed. But he understood her frustration. She felt like the rules changed and she was being left behind. Patricia said exactly. That was exactly how she felt. Gerald stood up and moved around the desk to face them directly. He said he had a proposal. They all had expertise he needed. He knew materials and construction, but there were aspects of theoretical engineering where he could learn from them, and he thought he had things he could teach them about practical application. So instead of fighting about who deserved what, why not work together? Patricia asked what he meant. Gerald explained cross-training. If they wanted to understand why he was promoted, they should spend time with him on the construction floor. Learn what he saw and how he saw it. And he would sit in on their design reviews and planning sessions. Everyone would get better at their jobs and the gateway would benefit. The three engineers exchanged glances. Gerald could see them wrestling with their pride and resentment and the logic of his proposal. Patricia asked what would happen if they refused. Gerald said simply that they could refuse. He was not going to force anyone to work with him. But Brandon Pierce had failed because he refused to listen to people who knew things he did not. Gerald would like to think they were all smarter than that. There was a long silence. Then Kevin cleared his throat. He admitted there had been times on this project when he wished he understood the construction process better. He designed things but did not always know how they were actually built. Gerald said then they should fix that. All of them could spend 1 day a week working construction shifts. And he would spend 1 day a week in the engineering offices. They would learn from each other. Patricia studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She said fine, but she would be watching him. If he screwed up, she would be the first to say she told him so. Gerald said that was fair enough. He expected nothing less. After they left, Lewis poked his head into the office. He said that went better than he expected. He had been listening and was ready to intervene if things got heated. But Gerald handled it well. Lewis said Gerald would face more of that. People who thought he did not deserve this position. Gerald said he knew. Half the time he thought they were right. He asked Lewis if he was actually qualified for this job. Lewis considered the question. He said if Gerald was asking whether he had every skill a lead structural engineer traditionally had, then no. But was he qualified to do what this job actually needed right now? Absolutely. Lewis explained that this station needed someone who understood construction from the ground up. Someone who would listen to the people doing the work. Someone who had the courage to challenge assumptions. Gerald had all of that. Gerald asked about the parts he did not have. Lewis said he would learn them with help from the council and from people like him. That was what a good leader did. They recognized their limitations and surrounded themselves with people who filled in the gaps. Gerald nodded slowly. He said they had better get to work then. The weeks that followed were intense. Gerald threw himself into learning everything he could about theoretical engineering, while still maintaining his hands-on approach to construction. He sat through design meetings where equations and simulations flew past him at dizzying speeds. He asked questions that others considered basic, and slowly, the answers started making sense. Patricia Hartley kept her word. She watched Gerald constantly, ready to pounce on any mistake. But she also started her construction shifts, and Gerald saw her worldview beginning to change. One day she came to him with grease on her hands and frustration in her eyes. She said she had just spent 4 hours trying to install a support bracket she had designed. It looked perfect on paper but was nearly impossible to actually fit into place in zero gravity. Gerald asked to see the design. He pointed out that while the bracket met all structural requirements, it did not account for how a human worker would need to position themselves to install it. With a small modification to the angle and the addition of a secondary grip point, it would be much easier to work with. Patricia stared at the modification, then looked at Gerald. She said she had never thought about that. Gerald said that was why cross-training mattered. Slowly, grudgingly, Patricia began to respect Gerald. She still challenged him in meetings and still pointed out when she thought he was wrong. But now it came from a place of collaboration, rather than antagonism. Kevin and Andrew followed her lead. The engineering team started functioning as an actual team instead of a collection of resentful individuals. The Galactic Engineering Council continued Gerald's education. Vexthar spent hours teaching him about stress analysis and material properties at a molecular level. Luminex showed him how to read electromagnetic field patterns. The two humanoid inspectors, whose names Gerald learned were Kira and Tam, taught him about dimensional physics and the mathematical principles behind gateway technology. But the aliens learned from Gerald, too. He showed them human problem-solving techniques, the way construction workers developed workarounds for unexpected issues. He demonstrated how tactile feedback could supplement sensor data. He explained the importance of building redundancy into systems not just mathematically but practically, with easily accessible manual overrides and backup procedures. One day, Vexthar told Gerald something that stayed with him. The coordinator said that the Talrathi had been building in space for 50,000 years. They had seen countless civilizations rise and fall. The ones that survived were not necessarily the ones with the best technology. They were the ones that maintained balance between innovation and wisdom, between advancement and humility, between trusting their tools and trusting their hands. Gerald asked if Vexthar thought humanity would survive. The coordinator was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that depended on whether humans learned the lessons that were being taught here, if they remembered that expertise came in many forms, if they valued experience as much as education, if they listened to people regardless of their position. Then yes, humanity had a chance to become something remarkable among the stars. 4 months after Gerald's promotion, the gateway reconstruction was complete. Every structural flaw had been identified and repaired. Every system had been tested and retested. The new safety protocols were in place and working smoothly. Workers reported concerns freely, and those concerns were investigated promptly. Engineers spent time on construction shifts, and construction workers attended design meetings. The divide between theory and practice had not disappeared, but it had narrowed significantly. Helen Morrison called a final meeting before the scheduled activation. The conference room was packed with people from every department. Gerald stood at the front with Lewis beside him. Helen asked Gerald to give the final status report. He looked around the room at all the faces, human and alien, engineers and construction workers, people who had learned to work together and trust each other. Gerald said the gateway was ready. Every section had been inspected not just by sensors but by experienced eyes and hands. Every potential issue had been addressed. They had built something that would last, something they could all be proud of. He paused, then added that the real achievement was not just the physical structure. It was proving that humans could learn, could adapt, could combine their strengths with those of other civilizations to create something greater than any of them could have built alone. The day of the gateway activation arrived with clear skies above Earth. Station Vega 7 hummed with controlled energy as final preparations were completed. Gerald stood in the main control center, surrounded by displays showing every aspect of the gateway's status. Beside him was Lewis, and around the room were representatives from every nation that contributed to the project. Observers from a dozen alien civilizations watched with interest. Coordinator Vexithar's hologram occupied a prominent position, his 3 amber eyes glowing with anticipation. The massive ring-shaped structure nearly 2 miles in diameter hung in space like a promise. It gleamed in the reflected light of Earth, humanity's first real doorway to the stars. Gerald felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Thousands of people had worked on this project. Billions more were watching from Earth below. Lewis reported that all systems were green. Power levels were stable, and the dimensional matrix was aligned. They were ready for activation on Gerald's order. Gerald took a deep breath. The past 4 months had been a whirlwind of learning and adapting and occasionally failing. He had made mistakes and been corrected by people like Patricia, who still delighted in catching his errors. But he had also taught and watched others grow. Gerald ordered final checks. He wanted manual confirmation from every section chief that their areas were secure. Over the next 10 minutes, reports came in from every part of the station. Gerald listened to each one carefully, noting the voices. Patricia confirmed the structural integrity of the gateway ring itself. Kevin and Andrew reported on power distribution systems. Dozens of others, human and alien alike, Each confirmed their piece of this enormous puzzle was ready. A familiar voice came through reporting that Section 12 was ready. Gerald smiled. That was Marcus Gray, one of the Zentari workers who helped repair the original structural flaw. Marcus had specifically requested to be assigned to that section for the activation. It felt right somehow, having someone who understood the importance of that early warning watching over it now. Lewis said finally that all sections reported ready. It was Gerald's call. Gerald looked around the control center one more time. Through the windows he could see the gateway and beyond it the stars. Humanity's first real step into the galactic community, made possible not just by technology but by people willing to listen to each other, to learn from each other, to set aside ego and pride in service of something greater. Gerald spoke clearly so his voice carried to every speaker on the station. He said they were about to activate the first human-built interstellar gateway. This structure represented the best of what they could accomplish when they worked together, when they combined theory with practice, when they respected both technology and experience. Whatever happened next, everyone here should be proud of what they built. He paused, then gave the order to initiate gateway activation sequence. The control center erupted in controlled activity. Engineers monitored displays and called out status updates. Power flowed into the gateway in carefully managed pulses, each one precisely calibrated. The massive structure began to glow with light building along its inner rim. Gerald watched the readings closely, his eyes moving from display to display. Everything proceeded exactly as designed. The dimensional matrix was stable. Power levels were within tolerances. The structural supports were holding perfectly. 15 seconds into the activation, alarms suddenly began to blare. Patricia's voice cut through the noise. She said they had a fluctuation in Section 37. The dimensional stress was exceeding predicted levels by 4%. Kevin called out that he was compensating with power distribution. He started to say he would reduce flow to Section 37. Gerald interrupted him. Something about the readings bothered him. The fluctuation pattern was not random. Gerald asked Lewis to pull up construction logs for Section 37. He wanted to know who did the final welding on that segment. Lewis searched the database. He said it was installed 3 weeks ago during the expansion phase. The welding crew was led by one of the new teams. They had just completed basic certification. Gerald's mind raced. A new team working on a critical section. They would have followed procedures perfectly and done everything by the book. But they would not have had the experience to recognize subtle variations in material behavior under extreme stress. He asked Patricia what the composition of the hull plates in Section 37 was. She said standard titanium carbide composite and asked why. Gerald asked what the temperature during welding was. Patricia checked the logs. She said exactly to specification. 1847 degrees. Gerald closed his eyes, reaching back through years of experience. Titanium carbide composite. Newly certified welders precisely controlled temperature. Then he had it. He said they welded it cold. Patricia's voice was confused. She said the logs showed the correct temperature. Gerald explained they hit the target temperature, but did not account for thermal expansion in the surrounding structure. The material contracted too quickly during cooling. Because the adjacent sections were at ambient temperature, it would have passed all tests under normal stress, but dimensional manipulation created different harmonics. Vexthar's deep voice interjected. He said if Gerald was right, increasing power would only make it worse. The section needed to be stress-relieved. Lewis said urgently that they did not have time for that. They were 43 seconds into activation. If they aborted now, they would lose all dimensional alignment. It would take weeks to recalibrate. Gerald stared at the displays, watching the stress readings climb. 4% over predicted levels, then 5%. The mathematical model said the structure could handle up to 8% overstress before failure became likely. But models were just models. Reality always had surprises waiting. Gerald asked sharply for options. Andrew suggested they could try adjusting the dimensional matrix to reduce stress on that section. But it would increase stress elsewhere. They would be gambling that the rest of the structure could handle it. Patricia said, or they could abort and start over. Gerald thought about Brandon Pierce, about the man's unwillingness to trust anything except instruments and protocols. He thought about Vexthar's words to trust tools but trust hands more. And he thought about the thousands of hours he spent learning to read the subtle language of stressed materials. Gerald asked Lewis if he could get a live feed from Section 37, visual and thermal. Lewis said it was done. A new display opened showing the hull plates of Section 37. To most people, they would have looked perfectly normal, just metal glowing with reflected energy. But Gerald had not become chief engineer by seeing what most people saw. There at the edge of one plate was a slight discoloration, barely visible against the glow. And the thermal reading was just a fraction of a degree higher than it should have been. Exactly the same signs he saw in Section 12 months ago. Someone called out that stress had reached 6%. Gerald made his decision. He ordered them to continue the activation, but reduce power flow through Sections 36 and 38 by 2% each. That would shift the dimensional stress pattern and reduce concentration on Section 37 without compromising the overall matrix. Patricia objected that this was not in the approved activation protocol. Gerald said he knew, but it would work. He asked them to trust him. There was a moment of silence. Then Lewis's voice came through calm and confident, saying he was adjusting power distribution now. The change was immediate. The stress readings for Section 37 began to drop. 6% overstress fell to 5%, then 4%. Patricia reported with relief in her voice that they were at 3% overstress and still falling. The dimensional matrix remained stable. The activation continued without further issues. Power built within the gateway, reaching levels that bent space-time like a sheet of rubber. The inner rim glowed brilliant white. Then, with a sound that was felt more than heard, space tore open. Inside the gateway ring, reality twisted and changed. Stars vanished and were replaced by a swirling vortex of colors that should not have existed. Through that vortex, impossibly distant, Gerald could see another star system, Tau Ceti, where the first gateway nexus had been established centuries ago by the Talrathi. Lewis announced that connection was established. The gateway was stable and operational. They had done it. The control center erupted in cheers. People hugged each other and shook hands and laughed and cried. Even the usually stoic Centauri workers clicked their crystalline limbs together in celebration. Gerald just stood quietly watching the impossible doorway hanging in space above Earth. Humanity's first real step into the stars. Vexthar's hologram approached Gerald. The coordinator said Gerald had gambled. He made a decision that was not in the protocols based on nothing but judgment and experience. Gerald asked if he was wrong to do so. Vexthar said on the contrary. Gerald demonstrated exactly what the coordinator hoped to see when they invited humans to build this gateway. The courage to trust oneself when necessary. This was the mark of a true master builder. 3 weeks after the successful activation, Gerald stood on an observation deck watching ships pass through the gateway. Human vessels and alien craft. Traders and explorers and scientists all using the doorway humanity had opened to the stars. It still seemed unreal sometimes. He was not alone on the observation deck. Patricia stood beside him with her arms crossed in her characteristic posture. But she was not frowning anymore. Patricia said she owed Gerald an apology. Gerald asked what for. She said for assuming he did not deserve the job. For thinking that because he did not have the same credentials she had, he was not qualified. She was wrong. Gerald glanced at her. He said she was not entirely wrong. He did not have all the knowledge he needed. He still did not, honestly. Patricia said maybe not, but Gerald had something more important. She gestured toward the gateway. He understood what they were actually building here. Not just a structure made of metal and energy, but a system that had to work in reality, not just in simulations. The rest of them got so focused on mathematical models that they forgot about the unpredictable nature of actual materials under actual stress. Gerald asked what changed for her. Patricia said the cross-training program changed everything. She spent 6 weeks working construction shifts. She learned that she had been designing things for years without really understanding how they were built. She would specify a weld without considering how difficult it would be to actually perform in zero gravity. She would call for tolerances that looked perfect on paper, but were nearly impossible to achieve consistently in practice. She was a worse engineer because she had never held a welding torch. She finally turned to look at Gerald. She said he made her better at her job by forcing her to do his, so thank you. And she was sorry for making his first few months so difficult. Gerald replied that she challenged him and made him prove he deserved to be there. He appreciated that, actually. Leaders who were never questioned tended to become tyrants. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching Earth slowly rotate beneath them. Then Patricia asked what happened to Brandon. Did Gerald ever think about him? Gerald said sometimes. Brandon was not a bad person, just someone who was promoted beyond his competence and did not have the humility to admit it. Gerald heard he was working as an equipment inspector now, something much more suited to his skills. Patricia asked if Gerald felt vindicated after the way Brandon humiliated him. Gerald considered the question. He said not really. He felt sad that it took a near disaster for the system to change. How many other people like Brandon were out there, dismissing good advice because it came from someone they considered inferior? How many projects had failed because expertise was ignored in favor of credentials? Patricia said fewer now, hopefully. The Galactic Engineering Council was using this project as a case study. They were recommending that all member civilizations implement similar cross-training and reporting protocols. Gerald had influenced how the entire galaxy approached engineering. That was a sobering thought. Gerald had never set out to change the world, let alone the galaxy. He just tried to do his job well and speak up when something was wrong. Lewis approached them with a datapad. He apologized for interrupting, but they had been approved for expansion phase 2. The council wanted them to build 3 more gateways, and they were asking if Gerald would oversee all of them. Gerald took the datapad and scanned through the details. 3 more gateways connecting Sol to different parts of known space. Years of work, massive responsibility, and the chance to help humanity establish itself as a true spacefaring civilization. Gerald asked Lewis and Patricia what they thought. Lewis said Gerald should do it. He had proven himself, and Lewis kind of liked working for someone who actually understood what he did. Patricia nodded in agreement, though she reserved the right to point out when Gerald was wrong. Gerald said with a smile that he would expect nothing less. Gerald thought about his father, who spent his life building skyscrapers and bridges with no recognition beyond a paycheck. His father who told him on his deathbed that honest work was its own reward. But it was nice when people noticed. His father would have been proud to see this moment. Gerald said all right, they should build some more gateways. As they walked back toward the control center discussing plans and timelines and technical challenges, Gerald paused one more time to look at the gateway. Light from distant stars poured through it, photons that had traveled for years only to take a shortcut through the doorway humanity built. A year ago, he had been just another construction worker dismissed by someone who thought credentials mattered more than experience. Now he was shaping the future of human expansion into space, working side by side with the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. But the most important thing, the thing that made all of this possible, was not his promotion or his new title. It was the principle everyone had learned. That expertise could come from unexpected places, that experience mattered as much as theory, and that listening to people regardless of their position or background made everyone better. The new gateway projects would be even more ambitious than the first. One would connect to a binary star system, where a young civilization was just beginning to explore space. Another would link to a region rich in rare minerals needed for advanced technology. The third would reach to the edge of known space, opening new territories for exploration. Each project would take years and require thousands of workers. Gerald knew the challenges ahead would be enormous. There would be new problems to solve, new techniques to learn, new mistakes to make and learn from. But he also knew he would not face those challenges alone. He had Lewis with his organizational skills and steady leadership. He had Patricia and Kevin and Andrew with their theoretical knowledge and growing practical wisdom. He had the support of the Galactic Engineering Council and the respect of workers throughout the station. Most importantly, Gerald had learned that leadership was not about having all the answers. It was about bringing people together, listening to their expertise, and creating an environment where everyone felt safe speaking up. It was about recognizing that knowledge came in many forms and that the person with the least formal education might see things others missed. These lessons would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. Helen Morrison called a press conference to announce the expansion projects. Representatives from Earth's governments and media outlets gathered in the station's main assembly hall. Gerald stood at the podium feeling uncomfortable in the formal suit Helen insisted he wear. He was more at home in a work suit with a welding torch in hand. But this was part of his job now, explaining to the world what they were building and why it mattered. A reporter asked Gerald how it felt to go from construction worker to chief engineer in just a few months. Gerald thought carefully before answering. He said it felt like validation, not just for himself but for everyone who worked with their hands and developed expertise through experience rather than classroom study. He said the galaxy was full of beings who understood that knowledge came in many forms. Humanity was finally learning that lesson too. Another reporter asked about the incident with Brandon Pierce. There had been rumors but few concrete details. Gerald said simply that mistakes were made and corrected. The important thing was not assigning blame, but learning from what went wrong. They had implemented new systems to prevent similar problems in the future. Those systems were now being adopted across the galactic community. That was the real story, not the personal drama. After the press conference, Gerald retreated to his office seeking a few moments of quiet. But Vexthar's hologram appeared before he could sit down. The coordinator said he wanted to speak with Gerald privately. Gerald gestured to a chair, though the hologram did not need to sit. He asked what was on Vexthar's mind. The coordinator said he had been thinking about humanity's journey to the stars. Every civilization that reached for space went through similar growing pains. They learned to balance ambition with wisdom, innovation with humility, individual achievement with collective success. Some civilizations learned these lessons quickly. Others took centuries. Some never learned at all and destroyed themselves through arrogance or internal conflict. Vexthar said he believed humanity would learn quickly because of people like Gerald. Not because Gerald was special or uniquely talented, but because he represented something important. He represented the understanding that everyone had value, that expertise could not be reduced to credentials, that listening mattered more than talking. These were not new ideas, but they needed to be rediscovered by each generation, by each civilization. Gerald asked what would happen to humanity in the long run. Would they become a major power in the galactic community, or remain on the margins? Vexthar said that depended entirely on whether humans maintained the lessons they learned here, if they remembered to value all forms of expertise, if they kept the channels of communication open between those who designed and those who built, if they stayed humble enough to learn from others while confident enough to contribute their own unique perspectives. The coordinator added that the Talrathi had been watching humanity for a long time. They saw potential but also recognized familiar patterns. Humans had a tendency toward individualism and competition that could either drive them to greatness or tear them apart. The Gateway Project showed that humans could cooperate across divisions of class and education and nationality when working toward a common goal. That gave Vexithar hope. Gerald thanked the coordinator for his honesty and his guidance. He said he would do everything he could to make sure humanity lived up to its potential. Vexithar's hologram flickered in what might have been a smile. He said that was all anyone could do. Then the hologram faded, leaving Gerald alone with his thoughts. The months that followed were filled with planning and preparation for the new Gateway projects. Gerald assembled teams for each location, making sure to include a mix of experienced workers and fresh talent, theoretical experts and practical builders. He insisted that every team follow the cross-training protocols developed on Station Vega 7. Engineers would work construction shifts, and construction workers would attend design meetings. Patricia became his deputy for the Binary Star System project. She had fully embraced the philosophy of combining theory with practice and was eager to implement it on a new construction. Kevin took charge of the mineral-rich region Gateway, bringing his expertise in resource extraction and processing. Andrew led the Exploration Gateway team, coordinating with xenobiologists and survey specialists to ensure the structure could handle whatever unknowns they encountered. Each project brought new challenges. The binary star system had complex gravitational interactions that required innovative structural solutions. The mineral region Gateway had to be built in an asteroid field, dodging debris while maintaining precise alignment. The Exploration Gateway pushed the boundaries of current technology, incorporating experimental systems that would allow it to adapt to unexpected conditions. Gerald traveled between all three projects, spending weeks at each site before moving to the next. He reviewed designs and observed construction and listened to concerns from workers at every level. He mediated disputes between engineers who wanted to push boundaries and construction crews who worried about safety. He celebrated successes and learned from failures. Most importantly, He maintained the culture of respect and open communication that had made the first gateway possible. 2 years after the first gateway activation, Gerald returned to Station Vega 7 for a ceremony. The Galactic Engineering Council was presenting awards to everyone who contributed to the project. Workers who spoke up about problems received commendations. Engineers who embraced cross-training received recognition. The entire team was honored for demonstrating how different forms of expertise could work together. Gerald stood on the stage with Lewis and Patricia and dozens of others. Helen Morrison gave a speech about the importance of listening and learning. Vexithar spoke about how the project had influenced engineering practices across multiple civilizations. Then Gerald was asked to say a few words. He looked out at the assembled crowd, seeing faces he had worked with, argued with, learned from. Gerald said the real achievement was not the gateway itself, impressive as it was. The real achievement was proving that humans could set aside ego and prejudice to work together effectively. They proved that respecting all forms of expertise made everyone better. They proved that the willingness to speak up and the humility to listen were equally important. These lessons would serve humanity well as they continued to expand into the galaxy. He finished by saying that he hoped no one would ever again be dismissed for lacking the right credentials when they had the right knowledge. He hoped no one would ever be afraid to voice concerns because of their position in the hierarchy. And he hoped that when future generations looked back at this moment, they would remember not just that humans built gateways to the stars, but that they did so by learning to truly value each other. The ceremony ended with applause and celebration. Ships from across the galaxy had come to witness the event. Some carried diplomats and officials. Others brought families who wanted to see the gateway that opened humanity's path to the stars. Children pressed their faces against viewing ports, watching ships disappear into the swirling vortex and emerge light years away in an instant. Late that night, Gerald returned to the observation deck where he had stood with Patricia weeks earlier. He was alone now, floating in the darkness with Earth below and stars above and the gateway glowing softly in between. He thought about the journey that brought him here, from construction worker to chief engineer, from dismissed and humiliated to respected and honored. But mostly he thought about all the people who never got the chance he received. All the workers throughout history who saw problems and spoke up and were ignored. All the people with valuable expertise who were dismissed because they lacked formal credentials. All the potential that was wasted because systems valued credentials over competence. He had been lucky. He had spoken up at the right moment and been heard by the right people. Gerald made a silent promise to himself and to all those who came before him. He would use his position to make sure others had the same opportunities he received. He would fight against systems that valued credentials over competence. He would create pathways for people with practical expertise to advance in their careers. And he would never forget where he came from or the importance of respecting everyone regardless of their position. The gateway pulsed with light as another ship passed through, heading toward distant stars and unknown adventures. Gerald watched it go, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was just the beginning. 3 more gateways were under construction. Plans existed for dozens more. Within a generation, humanity would have a network spanning the galaxy, connecting them to hundreds of civilizations and millions of worlds. And it all started because one construction worker refused to stay silent when he saw something wrong, and because enough people had the wisdom to listen.